I'd like to start the presentation today by thanking the organizers, the Commonwealth Local Government Forum, as well as the P&G Institute for Public Administration for the invitation to participate and to present at today's research roundtable. I'll be presenting today on the key findings of a recently published report by the ADB called Moving from Risk to Resilience, Sustainable Urban Development in the Pacific. And the purpose of the report is really to look at the factors that contribute to risk, to natural hazards and climate change extremities in the Pacific, look at some of the measures that could be taken by governments, particularly local governments, to integrate risk factors into the urban planning and management processes, and then look at some of the constraints to implementation in the region. So just to start off, as I'm sure you're all aware, Pacific Islands are highly impacted by natural hazard events and climate change. We've had the recent devastating floods in Honiara. End of 2012, Cyclone Evan caused a lot of destruction in Samoa, Fiji, and of course, Nandi and Fiji has experienced severe flooding in the past few years. And so, as this graph is really intended to illustrate, is just the extent to which natural hazards can impact Pacific Island economies. And on the left-hand side, you have absolute dollar losses, and on the right side, it shows losses as a percentage of GDP. And these are modeled losses based on disaster risk models that were developed for the region, and it looks at the impact at economic assets in terms of value losses. And unsurprisingly, Fiji and PNG are worst impacted in absolute dollar terms, being the largest economies in the region. But it's actually the smaller economies where disasters have a much higher overall impact on the economy in relative terms. And then, of course, Vanuatu is exposed both in absolute losses and as a proportion of the economy. And with climate change, we can expect the intensity and frequency of many of these events to increase. And also, climate change is expected to introduce new challenges such as sea level rise and temperature changes. So what contributes to risk in the Pacific? Until recently, disasters were really regarded as inevitable, that a natural hazard would result in a disaster event with loss of lives, damage to property and infrastructure. But it's increasingly being recognized that exposure and vulnerability play key roles in terms of mediating the relationship between the two. So in terms of exposure, this really relates to the physical location of the disaster elements exposed to natural hazards. So the Pacific Islands, many of which are located along the Pacific Ring of Fire, where many volcanoes and earthquakes occur. Also many countries located in the tropical cyclone belts. And then also Pacific Island countries like Kiribati and Marshall Islands near the equator that experience frequent drought and storm surges, high tides. Also, in terms of exposure, urban areas in particular are highly exposed to risk, and this is because of their physical location. A lot of urban centers in the Pacific are located along coastlines or in low-lying floodplains. For example, in Fiji, 8 of Fiji's 16 towns are located in low-lying estuaries, which are highly vulnerable to natural hazards such as flooding. And while such locations probably offered advantages in terms of agricultural productivity or facilitation of trade, they do expose urban centers to risk. And also urban centers concentrate people, assets, infrastructure, economic services, social services. And so there's a lot of people and property that's put in harm's way when disaster strikes. So urban areas in particular are highly exposed to risk. And as Pacific Islands urbanize, increasingly that exposure is expected to intensify. So just a quick snapshot of urbanization trends. Again, the left-hand side shows absolute numbers of the Pacific urban population in each of the Pacific Island countries, and on the right side it shows the urban population as a proportion of the total population. So overall, the Pacific urban population is just over 20%, including Papua New Guinea and Timor-Leste, which are the two most populous countries in the region. But these two countries are also still predominantly rural. So in the coming years, as people migrate to the urban centers in these countries in search of opportunities, urbanization will increasingly take place. And then in the smaller countries like Palau, Marshall Islands, Nauru, the population is already highly urbanized, with 3 out of 4 residents in these countries already living in urban centers. So urban risk is a particular concern, I think, to Pacific Island countries. So vulnerability, which is the other element which contributes to risk, is much more related to socioeconomic factors and urban governance. And this explains why two countries, for example, that experienced similar disasters, like Chile and Haiti with the earthquakes in 2010, it can have significantly different impacts. Whereas in Chile, with the earthquake that was stronger, 500 people died, versus Haiti, where 200,000 plus people died. So it really shows the role of institutions, emergency services, building codes in terms of helping to mediate the risk, and the social and institutional economic variables that come into play. And poverty in particular plays a role in vulnerability to risk in terms of being able to respond and cope to risk. It's often low-income households that lack the resources to cope and respond with disasters, particularly in informal settlements in terms of poor quality housing, and then after disaster strikes, not having access to savings or insurance to then recover quickly and bounce back from natural hazard events. And also basic service provision plays a key role in influencing vulnerability. Basic service provision, like water supply, sanitation, is often regarded as the first line of defense against hazards and can play a role in reducing the impact. So basic service provision is a key factor as well when looking at vulnerability. And just to highlight, this is a snapshot of access to water supply and sanitation in Vanuatu using 2007 data. And it shows access to water supply on the left and sanitation on the right according to income quintile. And it just shows that it's usually the lowest income household groups that have the least access to basic services, which is why they're generally most vulnerable to hazards and climate change. So given the risks faced in the region, what can governments, and particularly local governments, do to respond and address this risk? And these 2 points are just on the PowerPoint slide, are taken from the recent Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, fifth assessment report. There is a specific chapter on the impact of climate change on urban centers. And I think they summarized it well when they said that urban governments are at the heart of successful urban climate change adaptation, because so much adaptation depends on local assessments and integrating adaptation into local investments, policies, and regulatory frameworks. And they also go on to say that well-governed cities with universal provision of infrastructure and services have a strong base for building climate resilience. So it really is municipalities and local government that influence the use of land most directly through tools like municipal planning strategies, zoning bylaws, subdivision and site plan controls. And it's the local governments that are foremost the ones who drive the development of city and town plans. So they're the ones that set up the principles and policies concerning the nature of future growth and change in municipal areas over time. And again, it's local governments that are the ones that review and approve development proposals and determine whether such proposals are in line with municipal strategies or plans. So if local governments can guide and plan growth in a risk-sensitive manner, they can play a substantial role in reducing risk to natural hazards and climate change. So in terms of addressing risk, the starting point is really understanding the risks and collecting the data to determine what the probability of a particular event is of striking, its intensity, where it might strike, as well similarly climate change, collecting information on climate change projections to determine what that means for a particular urban area, and then putting it into a form that can be easily used to guide urban planning and management. This slide just shows a flood hazard map for a 1 in 100 flood year event in Apia, in the lower Vesingano area of Apia. And these visualization tools are really useful for urban managers for things such as land use planning, because you can actually look at some hazard maps and determine where particular areas within an urban center are most impacted, for example, by flooding, so flood depths in different areas. And this then allows urban planners to plan and manage growth appropriately. So, for example, in land use planning, zoning is one of the most commonly used tools, and risk-sensitive zoning involves looking at the risks and guiding developments away from risk hotspots and using land in high-risk areas for appropriate uses such as green space, green buffers, and then identifying safe areas as areas where future development should be guided for location of critical residential, economic, social services. Similarly, tools such as development controls, having risk information so if you can't move development out of a particular risk zone, making sure at least that buildings and properties are more resilient to the risks faced. So looking at, for example, minimum elevation heights for buildings, cyclone-proof roofing, or in the case, Tuvalu and Kiribati have regulations which require new homes to have rainwater storage facilities as a measure to protect against drought. So there's a variety of land use and planning controls which can be effective in responding to risk when available information is used and adopted in coming up with those plans and standards. Again, in terms of identifying critical infrastructure and guiding it away from hazard zones, this is just a slide. On the left, it shows the old Navua Hospital in Fiji that was located in a floodplain. So every time it flooded, the hospital would have to close and patients evacuated. And now it's being moved to, as you can see on the right-hand side, a much safer area of higher ground, but it's being moved at quite a substantial cost. So when planning critical lifeline services, using risk information to site lifeline infrastructure appropriately can be a cost-effective solution. Similarly, an area that's gaining more attention is climate proofing of major infrastructure investments. And this is an area that ADB is getting more involved in, because when you're putting in major infrastructure like roads or ports, sewage treatment plants, with lifetimes of about 50 years, it's really important that the infrastructure continues to perform over the period for which it was designed, despite future climate change extremities and events, to ensure that they provide the critical services. So being able to take climate change information and take it into consideration when coming up with engineering design standards is another important tool for ensuring that the sustainability of infrastructure and associated service delivery. This is just a picture of a port in Rarotonga that was recently upgraded, and it was upgraded using climate proofing measures so that the wharf is designed to take into account future sea level rises. And then just another point, often it's, as I mentioned before, it's really difficult to guide development, move development once it's already taken place in a particular hazard zone, but sometimes following a disaster, it provides an opportunity to build back better. So this is just an image of Hilo in Hawaii. And Hilo suffered from two major tsunami events, one in 1946 and 1960. And the tsunami event severely impacted the downtown core of Hilo, wiping it mostly out. And there was, after the 46 tsunami event, there was rebuilding again in the downtown urban zone, which was again destroyed in 1960. So following the 1960 event, local government decided to redesignate the affected areas as green buffer zones for low density development. So I'm not sure if you can see, but the green band at the foreshore is now used for recreational uses, for parkland, playing fields, as well as conservation areas. And the critical downtown core, where administration and economic activities are located, has been moved away from the hazard zone. And similarly, I understand in Japan, following the tsunami, they're also looking at designating affected coastal areas, putting in coastal green belts. And then a final measure I'll talk about briefly is ecosystem-based adaptation. Ecosystem-based adaptation focuses on preserving natural ecosystem protection services, and often ecosystem-based adaptation offers a very cost-effective way of addressing risk. For example, some work has been recently done in Lamy in Fiji, and a range of adaptation options for climate change were identified. And replanting mangroves were identified as being much more cost-effective of a solution than some of the structural, harder engineering options. Similarly, in Marshall Islands, some work has been done to look at the costs of protecting ecosystem services, shoreline services, to protect against surge and erosion versus the investments required to build seawalls to provide the same protection, and the ecosystem functions tend to be very cost effective. So just the slide on the left shows how a natural coastal buffer can be used to provide protection to property with a coastal setback. And the buffer basically not only provides protection, but allows the beach re-nourishment so that coastlines, again, are protected from erosion. And on the right-hand side, just as in contrast, is taken from South Tarawa to show where development encroaches on the beach. Not only does it put vulnerable households and property at risk, but also can contribute to erosion as well. So ecosystem-based adaptation, by providing that natural coastline buffers or other adaptation options, can be effective. So I'll just briefly go through a few constraints to implementing some of these measures, particularly in the Pacific. I won't propose to offer any solutions, but rather tag these as future areas for research. And I'd be interested to hear views today at the roundtable in terms of getting your feedback on how some of the constraints can be addressed. The first constraint is really getting risk information and climate change information so that local governments in the Pacific can use this and integrate this information to things like land use plans and development controls. In the past few years, there's been quite a bit of work, for example, under the Pacific Catastrophe Risk Assessment and Financing Initiative. A historic catalog of disasters was developed to develop disaster models for major disasters in the region. Similarly, an asset database for most Pacific Island countries with millions of information on millions of assets was developed that can also assist with risk assessment. Recently, the government of Australia has supported the development of the Pacific Climate Change Climate Futures Web tool, which has also helped by developing downscaled climate models. And then also where risk information is missing, there's been some innovations. For example, in the Cook Islands, they've piloted community-based vulnerability assessments. So it's been a really good way of bringing in information which might not be available to local decision makers using local knowledge, but also it's been a good way of mobilizing communities to get their participation and ownership of vulnerability assessments and plans. And similarly, informal settlement participatory planning, because in informal settlements, the information tends to be lacking in terms of condition of structures, population, density, and so on. So participatory informal settlement mapping also provides another tool. And then finally, another key issue is, although you have the scientific information on disasters and climate change risks, how do you shape that into a forum which is easily accessible and can be easily applied to the work of local governments in the Pacific, such as urban planners. And then another area is land management systems. Increasingly, urban growth in the Pacific is taking place in peri-urban areas that fall under customary land ownership arrangements outside of the municipal areas where town planning, for example, town planning schemes apply. And similarly, as urban centers grow, villages are being absorbed within the urban areas, but those villages don't fall under the authority of the municipal level government. So again, putting into place land use plans is challenging. And I think this is an area where we're potentially a huge area for research in terms of coming up with innovations. I think particularly moving towards more bottom-up approaches, so really encouraging participation of local communities and landowners in the land use development process. For example, one example is from the Pohnpei in the federal states of Micronesia, where they developed a participatory process for their land use planning, where they allowed 5 years for consultations with traditional landowners and community leaders to get their impact, so that land use planning was viewed more as an opportunity rather than a threat to traditional customary ownership, land ownership. And then finally, just institutional coordination. And when talking about urban resilience and risks with natural disasters and climate change, many, many different agencies at all different levels are involved. You have national governments, local governments, you have sector agencies like Ministry of Transport, utility service providers, those that provide power, water services. You've got the private sectors, communities, disaster management offices, climate change offices, so a whole range of stakeholders where many countries lack the effective formal or informal coordination mechanisms to share information and jointly come up with strategies. And this is where having an urban growth management plan to really provide a unified vision that everyone buys into to guide future growth in urban areas becomes helpful. And another example just taken from NANDI is the NANDI recently, a few years ago, the NANDI Basin Coordination Committee was formed through a global environment facility project that basically brings all these stakeholders together at regular intervals and have them discuss and raise issues, particularly how to effectively coordinate to address flood risks, which are a major issue in Nandi. So just to conclude, urban areas are particularly exposed and vulnerable to risk, and increasingly will be so with climate change, with the onset of climate change. And municipalities can play a key role in helping to build resilience and respond to those risks. Risk is often most effectively tackled through existing, when integrated with urban management and urban planning and management processes. So you get win-wins in terms of improving living standards in urban areas, but also addressing risk at the same time. But there's a number of constraints to implementing some of the measures that I presented today to promote sustainable urban development, which I guess flags future areas for research to come up with innovative solutions to the particular challenges in the region. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much.